Berkshire Hathaway just reported $397 billion in cash, the largest pile of money sitting untouched in its 60-year history, and the man who replaced Warren Buffett as CEO is still refusing to spend it. Hold that number in your head because I am going to come back to it near the end of this video, and it explains more about where this market actually is than almost anything else you will hear this year. My name is Chris, and I have spent over 3 decades investing my own money in public markets. If you want to protect your money while everyone else is chasing hype, subscribe and hit the like button. Before I get into what I'm actually changing, here is a quick gut check. If I told you that owning the S&P 500 meant owning 500 different companies more or less equally, would you believe me? Most people would say yes, it is false, and the size of that gap between what people believe and what is actually true is the entire reason this video exists. Here is the real number. The top 10 companies in the S&P 500 now make up roughly 37 to 41% of the entire index, up from just 19% a decade ago. Nvidia alone accounts for close to 7% of the index by itself, more than the entire energy sector or the entire utilities sector combined. Add in Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Broadcom, Meta, Tesla, Berkshire Hathaway, and JP Morgan, and that is your top 10. Here's the part almost nobody points out. Weight and earnings used to move together. Back in 2015, the top 10 held about 19% of the index's weight and produced about 19% of its earnings. Perfectly balanced. Today, that same top 10 holds 37 to 41% of the weight, but only produces around 32% of the earnings. The market is pricing these companies well ahead of what they are actually making, and it is doing that because of one shared assumption that AI spending will eventually pay for itself in a big way. I want to pause on why that assumption even took hold, because this is not just a math problem, it is a psychology problem. There is a well-documented pattern in how people invest called recency bias, where we assume whatever has performed well recently will keep performing well indefinitely simply because it is the most vivid thing in our memory. Pair that with loss aversion, the discomfort of missing a rally that everyone around you seems to be profiting from, and you get exactly the environment we are in right now. Nobody wants to be the one who sat out the biggest run of their generation. That emotional pressure is not a minor detail. It is one of the actual engines pushing valuations higher, independent of whether the underlying earnings support it. Now, before I make you think I am simply calling this a bubble and moving on, let me actually steelman the other side, because if I only show you the scary numbers, I'm not being honest with you. The bull case here is real, and it is stronger than most bubble callers give it credit for. Cloud revenue growth is not theoretical, it is showing up in quarterly earnings right now. Google Cloud has been growing north of 60% year over year, AWS around 28%, Azure around 39%. Anthropic alone now has over 1,000 enterprise customers spending more than $1 million a year with them, a customer count that reportedly doubled in under 2 months, and 8 of the 10 largest companies in America are customers. The Model Context Protocol, a technical standard that lets AI tools plug into business software, crossed 97 million installs by March of this year, which is the kind of adoption curve that does not happen around a fad. So this is not the dot-com era where a huge share of the money was chasing companies with no revenue at all. These are profitable, cash-generating businesses spending on something with real growing demand behind it. Here is the catch, and it is the specific thing that keeps this from being a simple bull story. Independent research from Epoch AI modeling hyperscaler spending found that operating cash flow across the 5 biggest AI spenders is growing about 23% a year, while their capital spending is growing about 70% a year. Those two lines cross, meaning capital spending overtakes actual cash coming in around the 3rd quarter of this year. Oracle has already crossed that line. Amazon is crossing it right about now. That does not mean the AI trade is fake. It means the difference between the bull case and the bear case is not about whether AI is real. Both sides actually agree it is. It is about whether revenue arrives fast enough to justify capital spending that is now outrunning the cash these companies actually generate, which is exactly why several of them have turned to debt markets and new stock offerings just this year to keep funding it. Alphabet alone announced an $80 billion stock offering in June specifically to fund AI infrastructure. That is a genuinely new piece of information most retail investors have not seen reported clearly, and it is the actual fault line running underneath this entire market right now, not simply hype versus no hype. So change number one, I am not selling my S&P 500 holdings, and I am not calling this a guaranteed crash. I am simply slowing down how much new money I add to it because concentration risk is real even when the underlying technology is real too. The obvious fix people jump to is an equal weight S&P 500 fund, where all 500 companies get roughly the same 0.2% slice instead of a handful hogging over a third of it. On paper, that sounds like the perfect hedge, but look at the actual performance gap. From 2023 through 2025, the standard market cap weighted S&P 500 gained about 68%. Over that same stretch, the equal weight version, the RSP fund, gained about 34%, roughly half. Why? Because equal weight funds follow negative momentum. When a stock takes off, the fund automatically sells shares of it to buy the ones that have not moved, just to keep every company at the same weighting. You are mechanically selling your winners to fund your laggards, and that constant rebalancing means constant trading costs, on top of missing the outperformance you were trying to capture in the first place. That is why I am keeping the bulk of my stock market money in the standard market cap weighted fund and simply directing less new money into it rather than switching versions entirely. Change number two is where that freed up money actually goes, and it starts with a question almost nobody asks seriously. What if the biggest returns of the next 20 years do not come from America at all? Picture the global stock market as a layered cake. Each country is a layer. The thickness of that layer shows how much of the world's total stock value that country controls, and the cake itself never changes size, only the thickness of the layers shifts. In 1900, Britain controlled close to a quarter of the entire global stock market. Betting against permanent British dominance would have sounded absurd to anyone alive at the time. It did not stay that way. I watched a similar story unfold with Japan firsthand, traveling there constantly through the late 1980s and early 90s, watching Japanese electronics and automotive companies dominate global markets while the US economy struggled through high inflation and slow growth. Almost every serious investor at the time assumed Japan's rise was permanent. Then, America came roaring back over the following decades. Here is a second example that hits even closer to home because it is not really about countries at all, it is about concentration itself. Back in the early 1970s, Wall Street had its own version of the Magnificent Seven, a group of blue chip companies nicknamed the Nifty 50, stocks like Coca-Cola, IBM, and Polaroid that investors were told you could simply buy and hold forever no matter the price because they were considered unquestionably safe. Sound familiar? Many of those companies were genuinely excellent businesses. That was never really the question. The problem was that everyone piled into the same handful of names at the same time. Prices detached from earnings, and when sentiment finally turned in the mid-1970s, several of those stocks fell 50% or more, and some took over a decade just to get back to even though the underlying businesses kept operating fine the whole time. The lesson is not that great companies stop being great, it is that even great companies can become bad investments purely because too much money crowded into them at the same price at the same time. That is a different lesson than the UK or Japan story, and it applies just as directly to today's top 10 as it did to the Nifty 50 years ago. Leadership in markets always eventually shifts, and nobody, no matter how confident, can tell you exactly when. That is precisely why I refuse to keep all of my money tied to a single country, even one as dominant as the US is right now. When your portfolio only holds the S&P 500, you completely miss out on companies like TSMC, Samsung, Toyota, Tencent, and HSBC, massive profitable global businesses that are simply headquartered somewhere else. A global index fund spreads your money across roughly 3,700 to 3,800 companies in more than 45 countries, and it rebalances automatically as the world shifts instead of locking you permanently into whichever country happens to be winning right now. Change number 3 is where I think the real underpriced opportunity is sitting, and this is the one part of this video with an actual number behind it that almost nobody is talking about yet. The giant companies at the top of the S&P 500 are all betting that whoever builds the single best AI model wins everything. But look at what has actually happened to the cost of running these models. Since 2023, the price of running a leading AI model has fallen by more than 90%, and some specific pricing tiers have dropped closer to 99%. At the same time, the gap in quality between the top 3 or 4 AI providers has narrowed sharply. Separately, industry data on companies running multiple AI models side by side instead of locking into one shows those companies cutting their operating costs by roughly 60% compared to businesses that commit to a single provider, while avoiding the vendor lock-in risk that reportedly affects over 40% of AI projects that bet everything on one model. Put those two facts together and you get a genuine price war brewing underneath the surface of the market. Think of it like gas stations. If one station charges $1.50 a liter and the one next door charges $3 for a slightly better blend, most drivers still buy the cheaper option because it does basically the same job. Once a technology becomes good enough, cheap enough, and interchangeable, the money stops flowing to whoever spent the most building it and starts flowing to whoever applies it the smartest at the lowest cost to a real problem people will actually pay to solve. That is why I am backing smaller companies that use AI intelligently rather than the giants racing to build the biggest model. They do not need to win an arms race, they just need to solve real problems cheaply without carrying the mountain of debt the bigger players are taking on. So I am putting money into small and mid-cap funds and actively looking at AI-focused startups building on top of existing models rather than competing with them. If I am wrong, I lose a small controlled amount by being early. If I am right, the upside is enormous because almost nobody else is positioned there yet. Quick pause here because I want to ask you something directly. Of the 5 changes in this video, which one do you think you are already the most exposed to without realizing it? Sit with that for a second because the honest answer for most people watching is the first one, concentration, and most people have never actually checked. Change number 4 rarely gets airtime in mainstream investing content, and that is gold, and the story here has moved fast even over the last 12 months. Every major leap in technology does not just create winners and losers, it creates instability, and this AI-driven shift is no different. Central banks purchased 244 metric tons of gold in the first quarter of this year alone, a 17% jump from the previous quarter. Gold has now overtaken U.S. Treasuries as the largest reserve asset held by central banks worldwide for the first time since 1996. In a survey of 76 central banks conducted earlier this year, 89% expect global gold reserves to keep rising over the next 12 months, the highest confidence reading that survey has ever recorded. Why does this matter for someone who has never bought a gold bar in their life? Roughly 3/4 of the central banks surveyed expect the US dollar's share of global reserves to keep shrinking over the next 5 years. Much of the buying is deliberately structured to avoid touching foreign exchange markets at all, funded through domestic purchase programs in local currency, a quiet, methodical way of building a national stockpile rather than a speculative bet. China's own gold imports jumped nearly threefold in the first quarter of this year compared to the quarter before. Much of this traces back to 2022, when roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank assets were frozen by Western sanctions. That single event told every other government watching that dollar-denominated reserves held abroad are not unconditionally safe, and gold, unlike a foreign bank account, cannot be frozen by another country's government. Gold hit an all-time high above $5,500 an ounce earlier this year, with forecasts from major banks putting it on a path towards $6,000 an ounce by year-end. I am not telling you gold is guaranteed to keep climbing at this pace, and I want to be fair to the skeptics here too, because gold pays no dividend, no interest, and no earnings. So if this turns out to be more momentum than structural shift, it can sit flat or fall for long stretches with nothing to show for it in the meantime. I am telling you why some of the most conservative, risk-averse institutions on the planet are treating it as a core holding rather than a niche one right now, which is different from telling you it can only go up. I personally hold physical gold as long-term insurance, and I dollar cost average into a gold-backed ETF for flexibility. I'm not trying to time the perfect entry point, and I'm not going all in. I'm simply allocating a small, deliberate slice of my portfolio to gold, the same way entire governments are doing right now. Which brings me back to that Berkshire Hathaway number from the very start of this video, and change number 5, cash. Berkshire ended the first quarter of this year with $397.4 billion in cash and short-term treasury bills, a new record, up from around $373 billion just 3 months earlier. Greg Abel, who took over as CEO at the start of this year, has continued the exact same pattern Buffett maintained for years, selling more stock than he buys quarter after quarter for more than 3 years running. Berkshire has trimmed its Apple position down from roughly half its equity portfolio to about a fifth. It stopped buying back its own shares for nearly 2 years because Buffett considered the stock too expensive relative to what it was actually worth. Buffett's own preferred measure of market valuation, comparing total US stock market value to the size of the economy, sat at roughly 225% as of earlier this year. Buffett has said readings above 200% amount to, in his words, playing with fire. None of this means a crash is imminent, and nobody, including Buffett or Abel, is claiming to know exactly when. What it does mean is that arguably the most successful investor of the last century has structured his own company to be a buyer, not a seller, whenever the next real opportunity actually shows up, rather than trying to guess the exact top. That is exactly why I am holding more cash than I used to, not because I am trying to time a crash, but because the biggest mistake I see investors make at any age is being forced to sell good long-term investments at the worst possible moment simply because they did not have cash set aside for an emergency. This is the same recency bias and loss aversion I mentioned earlier, just running in reverse, panic instead of greed, but it is the same emotional mechanism doing the damage either way. Extra cash on hand means you get to be a buyer when the market eventually corrects, and I say when, not if, because corrections have happened repeatedly throughout market history, and there is no reason to assume this cycle is somehow permanently exempt. So here is how I actually think about all 5 of these changes together. I split my whole portfolio into 4 simple roles instead of thinking about it as one big undifferentiated pile of money. The foundation is the S&P 500 and global index funds, the part that has to hold up everything else no matter what happens. So it gets the majority of my money even now. The frontier is the small and mid-cap AI adopters, a small, deliberately limited slice where I am willing to be early and willing to be wrong. The ballast is gold, weight that keeps the whole structure steady when everything else is swinging around, understanding that ballast can sit still or even drop for a while. And that is not a failure of the strategy, that is the strategy. And the reserve is cash, the part that exists purely so I am never forced to sell the foundation or the frontier at the worst possible moment. Nobody, including me, actually knows which future plays out from here. And if this video convinces you of one single outcome instead of preparing you for several, I have actually done you a disservice. The honest position is that the bull case for AI spending is backed by real growing revenue, and the bear case for AI valuations is backed by real cash flow math. And both of those things are true at the same time. So instead of trying to predict the one right answer, I built a portfolio that can hold up reasonably well across more than one version of it if you want to understand exactly how much you actually need invested to eventually live off your portfolio. Go watch how much you need invested to live off dividends right after this one. And if you want to keep building real wealth instead of guessing where the market goes next, make sure you are subscribed because I will see you in the next video.